ABC General Hospital spoilers reveal that Brook Lynn had lived through enough scandal to understand the difference between fear and catastrophe, and the moment the news of the accident began to spread through Port Charles, she felt that difference in her bones. Fear was sharp, immediate, and survivable. Catastrophe was slower. It moved like cold water through the body, finding every hidden weakness, every private shame, every lie that had not yet been spoken aloud. By the time Brook Lynn began replaying the evening in her mind, the sound of her own heartbeat had become unbearable. The wine with Lucy had seemed harmless at first, just another small moment of relief in a life that had become emotionally overcrowded. Then came the urgency, the rush, the need to get moving, the need to show up, the need to keep too many promises at once. Now all of it was coming back to her in fragments, headlights bleeding into darkness, speed that felt justified in the moment, the blur of motion, the kind of reckless forward momentum that only makes sense until the world around it breaks. Somewhere inside those blurred memories lived the possibility that she had done something unforgivable. What made the terror worse was not certainty, but uncertainty. If Brook Lynn had known immediately that she had caused a crash, she would have had a clear villain to fight inside herself. She could have confessed, collapsed, or tried to make amends. But this was more insidious than that. It was the possibility that she had kept driving, still wrapped in her own hurried frustration, while behind her another car swerved, another life shattered, another disaster took shape, because she had not been steady enough, careful enough, sober enough to stop it. The human mind will sometimes cling to doubt as a form of mercy, but in Brook Lynn's case, doubt became torture. Every second she could not account for turned into an accusation. Every detail she had dismissed earlier now came back with fresh cruelty. The road felt narrower in memory. The darkness looked heavier. Even the idea of arriving somewhere safely now felt obscene. She had reached her destination, and other people may have paid the price. Once the names attached themselves to the accident, the panic inside her changed shape. This was no longer an abstract tragedy unfolding somewhere in Port Charles. These were people she knew, people tied to the same small, emotional universe that always seemed to collapse in on itself when one reckless decision rippled too far. Jordan, Curtis. The possibility of Charlotte and Danny being caught in the same web of chaos only deepened the horror. Brook Lynn could not escape the sickening realization that if her car had been the spark, then every injury, every surgery, every bedside vigil that followed would carry some trace of her. It would not matter that she never intended to hurt anyone. It would not matter that she had not set out to destroy lives. Intent could not unbreak glass. Intent could not stop blood loss. Intent could not erase the fact that she had chosen to drive when she should not have trusted herself behind the wheel. That truth began pressing down on her with a force so intense it almost felt physical. And yet guilt was only one half of the nightmare. The other half was Phoebe. Sweet, fragile, innocent Phoebe, whose future had suddenly become tangled with the worst thing Brook Lynn might ever have done. Just as she and Chase had finally been given a chance, just as the dream of bringing that child home had stopped feeling impossible and started feeling real, this new shadow threatened to swallow it whole. That was what made the situation morally devastating. Brook Lynn was not merely confronting legal danger or public shame. She was confronting the possibility that one reckless night might cost her the right to become the mother she had already started becoming in her heart. The thought hollowed her out. She could imagine the nursery before she could imagine her own defense. She could imagine holding Phoebe before she could imagine hearing a detective say the words, driving under the influence. That contrast ripped her apart. The future she wanted most and the truth she feared most had now collided in the same moment, and she did not know which loss would destroy her first. The PCPD's involvement only sharpened the dread. Once the police stepped in, this was no longer a private moral crisis that could be contained within regret. It became procedural, formal, relentless. Investigations had a way of stripping emotion out of tragedy and reducing it to timelines, footage, witness statements, angles of impact, blood alcohol estimates, and the cold logic of causation. Brook Lynn knew that if the PCPD started pulling on the right thread, everything could unravel with terrifying speed. A camera could place her on the road, a witness could remember a speeding car. A small inconsistency in her account could become the crack that split open the entire night. She had grown up in a family where secrets often survived longer than they should, but this was different. This was not a romantic betrayal or a business deception or one more Quartermain mess that could be buried under money, outrage, and shifting loyalties. This was the kind of scandal that came with handcuffs, headlines, and consequences that lasted long after the tears dried. That looming investigation pushed Brook Lynn into the ugliest emotional corner of all, the space between confession and silence. One part of her knew that if she had caused this nightmare, then the truth belonged to the people who were suffering because of it. Another part of her recoiled from the idea of destroying everything before she even knew for certain what had happened. She began to understand how desperate people convince themselves to wait one more hour, one more day, one more piece of evidence before they speak. Silence rarely begins as evil. Sometimes it begins as shock. Sometimes it begins as a frantic need to breathe. Sometimes it begins as the desperate hope that reality is not yet what it seems. But the longer Brook Lynn sat with that silence, the more dangerous it became. What started as paralysis threatened to become concealment. And she knew enough about herself to understand that if she crossed that line, she might never fully forgive herself, even if no one else learned the truth. Chase saw the shift in her before he knew its full cause. He had always understood Brook Lynn's fierceness, her temper, her loyalty, her tendency to brace herself with sarcasm when she was breaking inside, but this was something darker. This was a woman moving through rooms as if the walls themselves might testify against her. Chase had spent enough time in uniform, around crime scenes and broken families, to recognize what panic looked like when it was trying to disguise itself as control. The problem was that his love for Brook Lynn immediately dragged him into a conflict he could not solve cleanly. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to steady her, shield her, pull her out of the spiral before it consumed her. But if her fear was grounded in truth, then protecting her might also mean stepping into moral quicksand. For Chase, the crisis became agonizing not just because the woman he loved was in pain, but because every instinct inside him was splitting in two. The man who loved Brook Lynn wanted to save her. The man who believed in accountability knew that salvation built on denial would eventually poison everything they were trying to build. That was why the pressure on Chase became so intense. He could not simply stand back and watch her drown in fear, not when Phoebe's future, Brook Lynn's freedom, and the integrity of their whole life together were on the line. He needed to act, but action itself had become a trap. If he urged her to come forward too soon, he risked helping her destroy their chance at becoming parents before the facts were fully known. If he helped her delay, even out of compassion, he risked becoming complicit in something much uglier. The law, which had once given structure to his sense of right and wrong, now felt painfully inadequate. Love complicated everything. Love made objectivity feel like betrayal. Love also made betrayal easier to justify. Chase could feel that truth creeping toward him, and it frightened him almost as much as Brook Lynn's panic did. This was how good people got pulled into darkness, not through grand malice, but through the slow corruption of noble intentions. Meanwhile, Brook Lynn's inner collapse kept worsening because the accident refused to remain an isolated event in her mind. It fused with every insecurity she had been carrying long before that night. Her fear of failing, her fear of not deserving happiness, her fear that whenever life finally offered her something tender, she would somehow ruin it with one impulsive choice. Phoebe became the emotional center of that fear. Brook Lynn had not merely wanted to foster that child. She had begun to imagine that this chance might redeem something wounded inside her, that building a home for Phoebe might finally quiet the parts of herself that had always felt too chaotic, too flawed, too late. Now that dream was infected by the possibility that she was exactly what the system feared most: unstable, reckless, unsafe. The cruelty of that possibility left her emotionally raw. It was one thing to lose a child because life is unfair. It was another to lose that child because your own hands helped create the disaster that took her away. As Port Charles shifted into crisis mode, the emotional atmosphere around Brook Lynn turned suffocating. Every update on Jordan or Curtis felt like another layer of weight pressing onto her chest. Every mention of the investigation made her pulse pound harder. Even ordinary conversations started to sound dangerous, as though one wrong question might crack her open in front of everyone. She was no longer just afraid of the PCPD. She was afraid of being seen too clearly by the people who loved her. Because if they looked closely enough, they might recognize the truth before she had the strength to speak it. And if Chase looked too closely, he might stop seeing a woman worth fighting for and start seeing the wreckage she had brought into their lives. That fear isolated her more than any possible arrest. Shame does that. It does not only punish, it separates. Yet beneath the panic, guilt, and self-preservation, one painful truth kept rising. If she had caused the crash, then silence would not protect what she loved. It would only delay the moment it all fell apart. That realization did not come to Brook Lynn as courage. It came as grief. Grief for the version of herself that thought this chapter of her life was finally beginning in hope rather than disaster. Grief for the possibility that Phoebe's future with her and Chase might already be slipping away. Grief for the innocent people who were now suffering while she stood in the unbearable space between suspicion and confession. By the time that truth fully settled in, Brook Lynn was no longer simply panicking over what the PCPD might uncover. She was facing the more intimate devastation of knowing that the biggest threat to the life she wanted might be the life she had actually lived. That is what makes this story so explosive. It is not just about a car accident, a police investigation, or even the legal danger hanging over Brook Lynn's head. It is about what happens when one reckless act collides with a woman's deepest longing to be trusted with a child. It is about the crushing moral cost of wanting desperately to hold on to love while suspecting you may already have endangered it beyond repair. It is about Chase being forced to decide what saving Brook Lynn truly means, shielding her from consequences, or helping her face the truth before the truth destroys them both. And it is about the haunting possibility that by the time the investigation reaches its end, there may be no version of this story in which everyone walks away whole. In Port Charles, people often survive scandal. They survive betrayal. They even survive the dead returning from the shadows. But surviving yourself after the worst version of your choices comes to light is a very different kind of battle. That is the one Brook Lynn is heading toward now, and the tragedy is that she may already know there is no easy way out. Gio and Emma may not have set out to become part of Brook Lynn's crisis, but that is exactly what makes their role so compelling. In a moment when Brook Lynn is unraveling under the weight of panic, guilt, and the growing terror of what the PCPD might uncover, Gio and Emma could become the unexpected force that steadies the chaos around her. Their bond carries a quieter kind of strength, one built not on power or manipulation, but on instinct, trust, and emotional clarity. While Brook Lynn is trapped inside her own spiraling thoughts, haunted by the possibility that one reckless choice may cost her Phoebe and shatter her future with Chase, Gio and Emma can see the human collapse underneath the scandal. They are close enough to feel the damage, yet still distant enough to recognize that Brook Lynn does not need judgment first. She needs someone to keep the situation from turning into something even more destructive. That is where a new kind of control begins to emerge between Gio and Emma. Not control in the cruel sense, but control over the emotional wreckage threatening to swallow Brook Lynn whole. Gio would likely feel torn because Brook Lynn rushed toward Charlie's pub because of him, which gives him a painful sense of connection to the disaster, even if he was never truly at fault. Emma, meanwhile, has the kind of emotional intelligence that allows her to notice what others miss. The tremor in Brook Lynn's voice, the forced calm, the fear that keeps leaking through every attempt to stay composed. Together, they could become the pair trying to contain the damage before panic pushes Brook Lynn into an even worse mistake. For Brook Lynn, that support would not bring peace. It would bring a new obsession, because once Gio and Emma begin helping her manage the fallout, she may become even more terrified of what they see. Every effort they make to protect her could deepen her shame. Every kind gesture could remind her of how badly she may have failed. Instead of feeling rescued, Brook Lynn may start feeling watched, exposed, emotionally cornered by the very people trying to keep her from collapsing. That is what gives the story its sting. Gio and Emma's involvement could help her survive the immediate crisis, but it could also force her to confront the truth she is most desperate to outrun. And in Port Charles, sometimes the people who save you are also the ones who make it impossible to keep lying to yourself.